Welcome to Silent Hill. If you're a gamer, even if you haven't played any Silent Hill game, you've probably heard about it and understand the franchise's complex psychological exploration that each game consists of. Maybe the famously known Pyramid Head or Bubblehead Nurse. If not, I want to tell you about Silent Hill 2. It's a survival horror game flooded with monsters, puzzles, an abundance of lore, and emotional and captivating stories within the town from side characters and especially our main character, James Sunderland. With Bloober Team's 2024 remake of the beloved game, it's worth discussing the intricate story, details, and how objects play a huge part of the game. In Bloober Team's Silent Hill 2, the objects that James Sunderland repeatedly analyzes, his hands, the radio, the memos, specifically the poster that omits the word guilt, and the jukebox, illustrate Repression's role in repetition compulsion. Using the player's ignorance of Sunderland's trauma and guilt as victim and perpetrator, the game's unreliable narration exposes the cyclical nature of repetition compulsion and how his metaphoric journey into Silent Hill and confronted self-inflicted trauma serves the individual as a coping mechanism to heal. This beginning shot is of his hands, which is an object he essentially carries with him for the entire game. They are the beginning of his trauma, his guilt even, and something that he repeatedly has to use to progress the game. Basically, he's continuously carrying with him the weight of his actions, but are also the main object in which he uses to continuously confront his trauma from beginning to end and dig himself out of the repressed memory he has. For longtime fans, they'll know that in this beginning scene, James has just recently killed his wife. However, for new players, they have no idea what's going on in this particular scene. All they know is that they're about to play as this character. With that said, it's important now to establish Freud's beyond the pleasure principle. As he says, I am not aware that the patients suffering from traumatic neuroses are much occupied in waking life with the recollection of what happened to them. They perhaps strive rather to not think of it. And that is exactly what James is doing in this beginning shot, not thinking about the traumatic event that has just recently happened. He just wants to find his wife Mary. In turn, the player wants to also learn why James is seeking out his wife in the first place, and what exactly called him to Silent Hill. Silent Hill is known for its terrifying monsters, so James's first encounter with the lying figure is no exception. William Chang's article, Monstrous Noise, Silent Hill and the Aesthetic Economies of Fear, describes his experience playing the first Silent Hill game, similarly to this unsurety of the second game and its monsters. After Chang's initial encounter in the first game, he describes this feeling of unease and how he doesn't know how much to trust the game as a player, or for the sake of the first game's protagonist, Harry Mason. The same feeling can be had for Silent Hill 2, as players and James don't really know what's going on or what to expect. Already establishing this sense of unreliability, which is further emphasized as James's actions are slowly revealed throughout the game. However, us as players are actively contributing to James's future as we choose to play, forcing his character into uncomfortable situations, making decisions at specific puzzles, and choosing when he heals, unknowing as to what we're all getting into. Right after James's initial encounter, a voice can be heard on the radio that James picks up. This is one of the first essential objects that James interacts with, and from it, Mary's voice calling out to him. With that said, Kathy Caruth's theory, Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative, and History, expands on Freud's theory of repetition compulsion. She gives an example of a romantic epic from Tasso, saying that the lover of the main character calls out to him, essentially meaning that through repeated actions and pain, there is a voice of the beloved that calls out, and in this case, Mary calls out to James, both through the letter and the radio. Continuing from this voice that calls out, Caruth says that there's a sense of otherness of the voice that calls from the wound, referring back to the epic, a voice that witnesses a truth that Tancred himself cannot fully know. In this case, the voice that calls out to James has witnessed a truth that both James and the player do not know, but it also represents this traumatic experience he's currently facing. Another thing to mention is that there's an achievement in the game called Radio Silence, in which the player turns off the radio and plays without it. The cutscene still has to play, but the radio will not play static sounds, which is used to alert the player and James of imminent danger. In a way, I believe that this is also an attempt to mute out the voice of Mary and further drown out her voice in silence, and also allow James to confront incoming danger on his own terms. This also could reflect on James's psychological state, as without the radio, it's easier for James to deal with the monsters, rather than to confront what he's done. This also could potentially mean James taking damage, as it aids players as well, which introduces the healing system, where players can choose to have James immediately consume a health drink or syringe, adding points to the leave ending, or wait a while between healing, which adds points to the end water ending. Each in turn reflecting the player's psychological state, as well as their ignorant cooperation in James's fate or healing by the end, because that split decision, heal or no heal, will immediately start adding points to one of the endings. The next significant object that James interacts with is the jukebox in Neely's bar. After this puzzle is completed, in which the player has to actively click the right buttons of the jukebox, a memory plays. James doesn't say anything in this moment, but it leaves players with a sense of curiosity. What exactly does this mean? Why is the game pointing it out? Why does the player have to interact with the jukebox to make it work, rather than James? These might not seem obvious, but it is doing a lot in terms of showing players exactly what's happening. James doesn't remember, further categorizing him as an unreliable narrator. But he also knows this moment is significant and has to do with his wife Mary, but at this point, we're both left in the dark. This is one of the first moments where we can identify James's repression of what he's done. In Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he says, "The patient cannot recall all of what lies repressed," and continues to say, "He is obliged rather to repeat as a current experience what is repressed, instead of, as the physician would prefer to see him do, recollecting it as a fragment of the past." This is significant in this particular moment of the game, because it's our first initial encounter with James's repression of the murder of his wife, instead choosing to interact with a positive memory, rather than face what he's done, but also essentially forcing the player to progress through this moment, allowing James further to avoid actually interacting in the cutscene, keeping his hands clean. Another section of the game that James has to tackle is the Brookhaven Hospital. Once you enter this area, one of the first objects James interacts with is this poster. When James approaches the poster and initially interacts with it, the player sees feelings of worthlessness or guilt. However, once you click the read button to more clearly read the text, this says feelings of worthlessness, in which the word guilt is omitted entirely. This interaction is in the player's hands, as James doesn't choose to interact with the poster on his own. A small thing that can be easily overlooked. However, further leans into James's guilt and demonstrates firsthand how he's repressing the guilt of murdering his wife. The player is making James interact with this poster, and by his omission of the word guilt, it further emphasizes his unreliability. Carruth says, "Trauma is not locatable in the simple violent or original event in an individual's past, but rather in the way that its very unassimilated nature, the way it was precisely not known in the first instance, returns to haunt the survivor later on." Since guilt is omitted, worthlessness is highlighted on its own to be read, which is attributed to James's current state. This creeping guilt is essentially haunting him throughout his journey in Silent Hill, but it's still unknown on the surface, as he doesn't feel guilty at this moment because there's nothing to feel guilty about yet. Though there will be inevitable guilt surrounding the murder of his wife as perpetrator, he also has trauma surrounding the verbal abuse of his wife as victim. So this object is doing a lot in terms of subtly providing context for the player and James surrounding his complex situation. Also, though his hands are noticeably dirtier at this point of the game, this is another way in which the player is dirtying their hands as they're actively interacting with things in order to come closer to the truth of James's journey as well. It's also worth mentioning that another passive gameplay element in the hospital is visiting Maria, a character working as a double for Mary, as she lies down while James and the player trek through the Fog World and Otherworld hospital sections. The more you visit Maria, the more points are added to the Maria ending, in which James will leave Silent Hill with Maria. So, in yet another way, the player here has the unknowing hand in steering James toward their version of his ultimate healing or continued self-inflicted trauma. The player being concerned about Maria enough to check up on her errs on this dependency the player might have on her, and in turn, the dependency James has, adding points to her ending and seemingly forcing James to replace Mary, rather than embracing his independence he literally killed for. In another instance, we're forced to see the jukebox a second time, forcing James to confront this memory again, but this time it's more tarnished, potentially revealing that we're closer to understanding the truth of his situation, but also how he's becoming closer to essentially recollecting his trauma, yet he's still repressing it unconsciously. Freud says the unconscious, i.e., the repressed material, offers no resistance whatever to the curative efforts, whether that's the player pushing James's character or James encountering this jukebox himself. Freud continues, it has no other aim than to force its way through the pressure weighing on it, either to consciousness or to discharge by means of some real action, meaning that James has no other option at this point than to press on. This gives players, and James, motivation to continue through the game in order to get closer to the truth. We want to know the truth, just as much as James, and Silent Hill continues to press him further to it. Eddie is another character that James encounters in Silent Hill. Each character here has a reason for being in the town, all dealing with their own struggles and traumas and crimes, and Eddie found himself in Silent Hill because he murdered someone. On your first playthrough of the game, you get an achievement after killing Eddie called A Human Being, with the description of Kill Eddie. This is significant because at this point, we are so close to the end, with only one section left of the game, so the truth of James's repression of his actions is almost at the surface. Carruth says, what returns to haunt the victim is not only the reality of the violent event, but also the reality of the way that its violence has not yet been fully known. As first-time players get this achievement, and James's face holds disgust and disappointment, we collectively acknowledge what James has just done, kill his first non-monster of the game, however you define that. He repeats the action of analyzing his hands here, as he is responsible for Eddie's death, and from this angle, the player is positioned where Eddie is, looking up at our murderer. When the camera closes in on James's face, he has a look of unsurety, like he's right at the cusp of understanding. However, it's also representing that as he's closer to fully confronting his trauma and those repressed memories, his hands are getting metaphorically dirtier now that he's killed another person, but coming closer to recollecting the murder of his wife and understanding the metaphorical and literal blood on his hands. In my first playthrough, I couldn't find health for James near the beginning, but especially after this encounter with Eddie, as he's arguably the most difficult boss, and didn't think anything of it. However, the game interprets this as James wanting to linger in both mental and physical pain, which again, the player is responsible for James's pain and how he progresses through the story, but this pushes you to the in-water ending. In turn, Eddie's boss fight is one of the most punishing, and how the player reacts to healing in this moment is also a reflection in potential guilt they might have for killing Eddie, which most likely is close to none, but we still aren't quite sure if James deserves the pain he's been caused by Eddie at this point. After Eddie's horrific boss fight, we finally encounter the jukebox a third time at the Lakeview Hotel in the Venus Tears Bar, where it's sparking and even more damaged, right after he obtains the videotape that shows him murdering his wife, though we don't know that at this point. I'll also note that I was injured for a while at this point as well, and by keeping James in consistent pain, even undesiring, I was contributing to his fate and the way he feels by the end of the game. He possesses the truth in his hands, the videotape, and I see this as the potential dread and pain he's in, as the truth is at the tip of his fingers, yet we still have to wait before it can fully be revealed. In turn, the player is also experiencing a type of dread, awaiting the tape, but maybe even relief at the fact that we're almost there. We also see the jukebox a fourth and final time, where it's halfway submerged in water, right after we watch the videotape, further showing the downfall of this object as James and the player come to know the truth. Though I wasn't injured at this time, even in my first playthrough, I took note of the jukebox once again and directly correlate the degradation of the jukebox to James's feelings about his wife and actions, as it's pristine in the beginning, and now almost completely submerged in water, pun intended. But the water in this case is acting as a metaphor of quite literally drowning in guilt, which To touch on the in-water ending, James kills himself by driving his car into the Toluca Lake, drowning because of his guilt. So this jukebox is doing so much work to let the player know what subtly might be to come, or strictly hint at James's feelings at this point. Though the jukebox is a very significant object in the game, it's one in which the player interacts with more than James, but it also serves as a beacon of player understanding, both in James's mental state and our realization for what James has done, and how we've forced him to deal with confronting his trauma. This is because now that we have encountered it multiple times, we know it's significant, yet we still push through Silent Hill alongside James in search for the answers and healing we all desire. In this video essay, I discussed my first playthrough a couple of times, and how I struggled to keep up with healing James. In turn, I did get the in-water ending. If you're a gamer, you understand how active choices you make in the game, when faced with them, can sway the ending, but even then, I didn't initially understand how much of an impact these passive decisions about health contribute to James's ending, and ultimately tackled each puzzle with skepticism. As a player, we unknowingly take part in his fate or healing journey. Because of this, the in-water ending, even after interacting with previously mentioned objects, demonstrates how both the player and James are not able to handle the guilt. The player learns he's responsible for the death of his wife, and initially, this is extremely jarring, as we know how unreliable James's character is, but we also might feel a sense of guilt for not taking better care of James throughout the game, or forcing him to push through now that he's killed himself by driving into the Toluca Lake. The ending is canon, according to Masahiro Ito, Team Silent's original game artist. However, it perfectly encapsulates how one's mental state after fully recollecting a traumatic memory might be too overwhelming for one to overcome. With that said, on my second playthrough, I was able to get the Leave ending, in which James leaves Silent Hill with a little girl that also knew Mary, named Laura. I made sure that I scavenged enough health to ensure James's health and comfort throughout the game, and tackled the objects and puzzles head-on. I knew what James had done on this replay, and no longer feel as if he deserves to linger in his guilt. He deserves to heal, especially after going through so much in Silent Hill, and forcing him to repeatedly interact with those objects that bring him as much pleasure as they ultimately bring pain. By him leaving, I felt as if I could also heal, and move past the horrors that lie in the town, but James is also able to finally move past this. He no longer has to deal with his monsters, as he's officially dealt with what he has done, and has not only been forgiven by his wife, but he has also forgiven himself. As someone playing this game, ultimately, your decisions do impact the game, but your passive decisions also actively contribute to James's conclusion, whatever that may be. In that way, I see how a person plays as a sort of reflection. Are you one to immediately tend to your wounds, or do you let it linger a bit to heal itself, physically or mentally? Do you work through your guilt and grief by talking about it, or do you avoid it entirely? I gravitate toward the latter. In turn, do you see James as someone guilty who doesn't deserve a second chance? Maybe he gets the second chance with the replacement of his past lover with a new, healthier person. Or maybe he deserves to start over, as he's paid his dues in Silent Hill and owned up to his mistakes. Regardless, there's no way of knowing if you play through Silent Hill blindly. That's ultimately going to be how you play the game. But maybe you're also like me, and you've seen what could be, his death, and now what should be, redemption, for both James and yourself.
The truth is, I hated you. I wanted you out of the way. I wanted my life back.
If that's true, then why do you look so sad?
Mary.
It's okay, James. here.
I want you to go on. I want you to live. For yourself and for others. Like you did for me. James, you made me happy.